The lightning split the New Mexico sky like God's own judgment, illuminating Clara Bell's terror-stricken face as she stumbled through the muddy prairie near Dead Crow's Hollow. Her bare feet slipped on wet grass, and she pressed both hands against her swollen belly as another contraction seized her with merciless force. The pain was so intense, she nearly collapsed against a fence post, gasping for air that tasted of rain and desperation. "Please," she whispered to the storm, to the darkness, to anyone who might be listening. "Not here. Not like this." Behind her, cutting through the chaos of thunder and wind, came the sounds she had learned to fear more than death itself, and the rhythmic pounding of horses' hooves on saturated ground. 3 riders were closing the distance between them, their torches cutting through the night like harbingers of death. At 20 years old and 9 months pregnant, Clara had been running for over a year. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. The contractions had started an hour ago, as distant rumbles in her abdomen mimicking the thunder overhead. But now they came in waves that doubled her over and forced her to grip whatever support she could find. She knew with terrifying medical certainty that stress and exhaustion were triggering premature labor, whether she found safety or not. The baby was coming, and she would either deliver her child in freedom or die trying to protect the secret that had already cost her everything she loved. Her father's voice echoed in her memory as she forced herself to keep moving. "If anything happens to me, daughter, that locket proves the mine belongs to us. Keep it secret. Keep it safe. One day it might be the only thing standing between our family and complete destruction." John Bell had been a methodical man in his 40s, honest to a fault, and respected among legitimate miners throughout the territory. His discovery of rich silver deposits in 1870 had seemed like divine blessing until Elias Thorne decided to steal them through systematic murder and forged documents. The fire that consumed Clara's family cabin in 1874 had been no accident, and she could still smell the smoke, still hear her mother's screams as flames engulfed their home. Thunder crashed overhead as she reached a deep gully carved by years of flash floods, and her exhausted legs finally gave out. She tumbled down among sharp rocks and thorny brush to land hard against a massive boulder, the impact driving precious air from her lungs and sending fresh agony through her contractions. Blood mixed with rainwater soaked through her torn dress, and she realized with growing horror that her body was preparing for childbirth in this godforsaken ditch. "There she is," a gruff voice shouted from above, triumph clear in the tone. "The thief who's been causing all our trouble. Finally got the little rat cornered." Another voice added with cruel satisfaction. "Boss said to bring her back breathing if possible, but dead works just as well." Clara pressed herself against the rocks and tried to become invisible, knowing the effort was futile, but unable to surrender hope completely. The gully was filling with rushing water from the storm, and even if the gunmen somehow missed her in the darkness, she might drown in this natural trap before morning. This was how her story would end, murdered like an animal in a ditch, her father's sacrifice rendered meaningless, her unborn child denied even the chance to draw breath. The sound of spurs jingling on rock announced the riders' approach as they dismounted to search more thoroughly. Clara clutched the rusted locket around her neck, the only thing of value she possessed, and the reason 3 armed men wanted her dead. Inside that tarnished metal case lay a fragment of legal documentation that could topple the most powerful man in New Mexico territory if it ever reached honest authorities. Then a shadow moved above the gully's rim, and everything changed. Yiska appeared like vengeance itself, materializing from behind a cluster of boulders, with his Winchester rifle already trained on the lead rider. The 30-year-old Navajo warrior's face had been carved by wind and sun into planes of determination and quiet strength that spoke of someone who had never backed down from necessary fights. His traditional buckskin clothing, reinforced with trade cloth and metal studs, created practical armor, suitable for the harsh realities of frontier warfare, while the feathered war bonnet he wore marked him not as decoration, but as a proven protector of his people. For 3 years, Yiska had watched Elias Thorne's mining operations spread across the landscape like poison, reaching deeper into Navajo territory with each passing season. Mercury-laden runoff killed fish in streams, where his people's children once played safely. Hydraulic mining techniques stripped away sacred sites that connected the Diné to their ancestral heritage. And the constant industrial noise drove away deer elk and other game that provided essential protein for tribal families struggling to maintain their traditional way of life. Each act of environmental destruction filled Yiska with controlled rage. But he was a patient man who understood that direct confrontation with Thorne's private army would only result in greater suffering for innocent Navajo families. He had been waiting for the right moment to strike back, an opportunity to damage Thorne's operations without triggering massive retaliation against defenseless people. Tonight, hearing a woman's terrified cries cutting through the tempest, he had found that moment. His sharp whistle pierced the storm with commanding authority, bringing an immediate response from Windrunner, his paint stallion. The horse thundered into view at the gully's edge and reared dramatically between the gunmen and their intended victim, hooves flashing in the lightning as it created a living barrier that disrupted their carefully planned ambush. Chaos erupted with the sudden violence of summer lightning. Pike, the scarred leader of the hunting party, raised his Colt .45 and shouted above the thunder, "There, the breed's protecting the thief." The racial slur carried centuries of hatred, but Yiska felt only cold focus as his Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession. The first shot took Pike's center mass, the impact lifting him from his saddle to fall broken among the rocks below. The second bullet tore through another rider's shoulder, sending him screaming and fleeing into the darkness as blood streamed down his arm. The third gunman, a grizzled veteran named Carver, who had survived too many fights to ignore clear evidence when he saw it, sized up the tactical situation with professional calculation. 2 men down 1 opponent, demonstrating expert marksmanship from superior position with excellent cover. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. "This ain't worth dying for," he shouted to his wounded companion, wheeling his mount toward retreat. "Thorne can find another way to get what he wants." Within moments, the surviving attackers had vanished into the storm, leaving only corpses and the echoes of violence. But Yiska knew they would return with reinforcements once they reported the encounter to their employer. Time had become the most precious commodity. He leapt down into the gully with practiced agility, his boots splashing in rising water as he approached the terrified woman. Clara looked up at him with eyes wide with shock and expectation of death, having learned through bitter experience that strangers usually meant additional danger in her world of constant persecution. Instead, Yiska knelt beside her and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch conveying reassurance rather than threat. "You are safe now," he said in carefully pronounced English, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the chaos surrounding them. But as his experienced gaze moved from her pale, frightened face to her blood-soaked dress and the unmistakable signs of imminent labor, he understood that her greatest danger was not behind them in the form of defeated enemies. It was happening right now, triggered by stress and trauma that could not be wished away. The baby. Clara gasped through another contraction that seemed to tear through her entire body. "It's coming now. I can't make it stop. Now we need shelter." Yiska said, his mind already calculating distances and options. "My people's camp is not far, and there is a healer there who has delivered many children safely." Without wasting precious moments on extended explanations or false reassurances that would help no one, Yiska lifted Clara as carefully as possible onto Windrunner's broad back, supporting her weight, while ensuring the horse maintained stable footing on ground made treacherous by rushing water and hidden obstacles. As they rode through the diminishing storm toward sanctuary, he could feel her contractions intensifying with each mile they covered. The Navajo encampment along the San Juan River represented both ancient tradition and modern adaptation, a cluster of structures that demonstrated how the Diné had learned to survive in an increasingly hostile world, while maintaining their cultural identity and spiritual connections to the land. Traditional hogans, with their distinctive octagonal construction, stood alongside canvas shelters and wooden buildings, creating a community that could remain largely invisible to government agents and opportunistic settlers, while providing security for families trying to rebuild their lives after years of systematic persecution. Here, along winding curves of water that had sustained countless generations, Yiska's people had attempted to reconstruct their existence after the trauma of Hueldi, the Long Walk, of 1864, when the United States Army had forced thousands of Navajo from their ancestral lands to internment at Bosque Redondo. The experience had scarred entire families, separating children from parents and destroying traditional relationships with sacred places that defined tribal identity. Na'al-Yehe. The camp's senior healer was a woman whose 60 years contained accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of oral tradition. Her hands held knowledge of medicinal plants, spiritual healing techniques, and the complex relationships between physical and emotional wellness that Anglo-American medicine was only beginning to understand. When Yiska carried the injured white woman into her hogan shortly before midnight, she asked no questions about ethnicity, circumstances, or potential consequences for harboring a fugitive. Life comes when it chooses. Na'al-Yehe said simply in her native language, then switched to broken English for Clara's benefit. "We help is right thing." Through the long hours of that tempestuous night, as rain continued to drum against the traditional dwelling's walls with gradually diminishing intensity, Clara gave birth to a son under Na'al-Yehe's expert care. The labor was complicated by weeks of malnutrition, constant stress, and the physical trauma of her desperate flight across hostile territory. But the elder woman's skill with traditional medicines and sterile techniques brought both mother and child through the ordeal alive and remarkably intact. The baby, though smaller than ideal due to his mother's hardships, possessed strong lungs and a determined grip that suggested he had inherited Clara's will to survive against overwhelming odds. Na'al-Yehe cleaned and swaddled him in soft rabbit fur, then placed him in Clara's exhausted arms as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the dissipating storm clouds. "He is strong," the healer said in carefully measured English, recognizing that reassurance would be more valuable than detailed medical observations. "He will grow healthy and tall if you both rest properly and allow your bodies to heal from this ordeal." "Thank you," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held her son for the first time. "Thank you for giving him life when I thought we would both die in that ditch." For 2 weeks, Clara remained under Na'al-Yehe's watchful care, slowly regaining strength that had been depleted by months of hardship, fear, and inadequate nutrition. The Navajo community's hospitality extended far beyond mere shelter. Women brought nourishing food prepared according to traditional recipes that promoted healing and recovery. Children played quietly nearby to provide gentle distraction from worry and pain. And men stood guard in rotating shifts to ensure no unwelcome visitors disturbed the healing process. During this period of gradual recovery and the slow return of hope, Clara and Yiska shared their stories with increasing openness and mutual trust. Clara spoke of her transformation from secure daughter of a respected miner to homeless fugitive, describing in painful detail the comfortable existence that had been destroyed in a single night of calculated arson and systematic murder. "My father was always methodical about everything," she explained while nursing her infant son in the warm safety of Na'al-Yehe's hogan. "He used to say that preparation was the key to success in any endeavor, whether you were staking a mining claim or building a cabin for your family. Measure twice, cut once. That was his favorite saying when he worked on any project." "He sounds like a wise man," Yiska replied, watching the baby nurse with obvious contentment. "What happened to him?" Clara's face darkened with remembered pain and anger. "He found evidence that someone was forging ownership documents to steal successful claims throughout the territory. Papa spent months gathering proof because he wanted to build a case so strong that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore it or dismiss it through legal technicalities. John Bell had been a man who believed in doing things the right way, even when shortcuts were available and seemingly profitable. When he discovered rich silver deposits in 1870, after months of careful surveying and geological analysis, he had filed his claims through proper legal channels and paid all required fees to territorial authorities. The Prosperity Mine, as it came to be known, had produced enough wealth to support his family comfortably, while allowing him to reinvest profits in improved equipment and safer working conditions for the men he employed. But his caution cost him his life. Clara continued, her voice growing bitter with the memory. While he was building his perfect case, the men he was investigating struck first. Papa disappeared in 1873 after meeting with Elias Thorne to discuss what he called irregularities in mining claims documentation. His body was never found. "And then they came for your family," Yiska said, understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had destroyed Clara's previous life. A year later. The fire looked like an accident overturned lantern in the barn, they said. But I knew better. I saw men riding away from our property that night, and one of them wore Thorne's distinctive silver belt buckle. Clara's voice broke slightly as she remembered. Mama and my little brother Michael didn't make it out. I barely escaped with my nightgown and the locket Papa had given me weeks before he vanished. Her pregnancy, she confessed, with obvious shame and lingering regret, had resulted from trusting Marcus Webb, a traveling salesman, who had seemed to offer genuine affection and companionship during the darkest period of her grief and isolation following her family's murder. He came through town last winter selling household goods and farm equipment to families who could afford such luxuries. Clara said, staring at her sleeping infant with a complex mixture of love and bitter memory. He was handsome and charming, with stories about exciting places he'd visited and promises about the wonderful life we could build together. And when he learned about the child, Yiska asked gently, he took what little money I'd earned doing sewing work and disappeared in the night. Never saw him again, never heard from him, never received any explanation or apology for his abandonment. Clara's voice was steady now, hardened by acceptance of betrayal. That's when I truly understood that I was alone in the world, with nothing but enemies hunting me and a baby on the way. Yiska, in turn, described his own motivations for opposing Thorne's mining operations with growing passion and personal commitment to environmental justice. The destruction was more systematic and devastating than most outsiders realized or cared to acknowledge, extending far beyond immediate industrial sites to affect entire ecosystems and traditional ways of life. Each day those mines operate using their destructive methods, my people suffer more. He explained with quiet intensity that spoke of deep personal commitment to his community's welfare. Mercury used in ore processing contaminates the Rio Grande for miles downstream, killing fish that provide food for both Navajo and Mexican families who depend on the river for their survival. I've seen the dead fish, Clara said quietly. When I was hiding near the river last spring, there were hundreds of them floating belly up in the shallows. The smell was terrible. That is why I fight against Thorne's operations. Yiska continued, his voice carrying controlled anger that never quite erupted into open rage. He sees this land only as something to be exploited for maximum short-term profit. He cannot understand that some things, clean water, healthy animals, places where our children can play safely, are more valuable than all the silver buried in these mountains. The environmental impact extended beyond water pollution, to include massive soil erosion caused by hydraulic mining techniques that stripped away vegetation and topsoil, destroying traditional gathering places where medicinal plants grew and creating barren landscapes that would take decades to recover naturally. My grandfather used to take me to places that are now nothing but poisoned holes in the ground. Yiska said, his voice thick with emotion. Springs where our people had gathered for ceremonies since time immemorial, now contaminated with chemicals that make the water unsafe for any living creature to drink. During Clara's gradual recovery and the slow strengthening of her newborn son, 3 individuals entered their lives who would prove crucial in the struggle ahead, each bringing unique skills, knowledge, and moral complexity to their growing alliance against Thorn's systematic oppression. Deputy Samuel Riggs was a territorial lawman whose 45 years had been marked by the slow erosion of idealism under the relentless pressure of political reality and personal compromise. He had once believed passionately in justice and the rule of law, entering law enforcement with genuine desire to protect innocent people and maintain order in frontier communities where violence was common and legal structures were often inadequate. But Thorn's systematic corruption of local government had forced Riggs into increasingly uncomfortable positions that violated his original principles and destroyed his faith in the system he had sworn to serve. When he first encountered Yiska and Clara at his office in Willow's End, his exhaustion was evident in every word. 20 years I've been wearing this badge, Riggs said, slumping in his chair behind a desk covered with wanted posters and legal documents. Started with high ideals about protecting the innocent and serving justice. Now I spend most of my time looking the other way, while powerful men commit crimes that would get ordinary folks hanged. What happened to change things? Yiska asked, genuinely curious about the lawman's transformation. Thorn happened, Riggs replied bitterly. Started small pressure to ignore minor infractions by his employees, warnings that investigating certain incidents might be unhealthy for my career. Then it escalated to judges being bought, juries being intimidated, witnesses disappearing in the night. The deputy's respect for Yiska had been earned 3 years earlier during an attack on a settler wagon train 20 miles southwest of Silver Creek, an incident that had fundamentally shaped his opinion of the Navajo warrior's moral worth and personal courage. I was tracking a gang of Comancheros when I heard gunfire, Riggs explained. By the time I reached the scene, you and your warriors had already driven off the attackers and were tending to wounded families. What impressed me wasn't just your fighting skills, it was how you made sure everyone was safe before you left. Protecting innocent life is every warrior's duty, Yiska replied simply. Maybe among your people, Riggs said with a rueful smile. But I've seen plenty of white men who wouldn't risk their lives for strangers, especially not for families of different races or backgrounds. Marisol Vega represented another crucial alliance in the developing conflict. Though her loyalty was based on intensely personal rather than abstract moral grounds. The 35-year-old Mexican widow operated a ferry service across the Rio Grande at a strategic crossing point, running a pragmatic business that served travelers regardless of their ethnicity, destination, or legal status. When Clara first met her, Marisol was working to repair damage to her ferry dock, caused by recent flooding, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as she secured new planking. You are the woman everyone is looking for, Marisol said matter-of-factly, not bothering with pretense or diplomatic evasion. The one with the big reward on her head. I am, Clara replied, holding her baby protectively. Does that mean you're going to turn me in for the bounty? Marisol laughed, but not unkindly. I owe this man my son's life, she said, nodding toward Yiska. 2 years ago, Roberto fell into the river during flood season. The current was too strong for me to reach him, and I thought God had taken my only child. What happened? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Yiska appeared from nowhere, dove into the water without hesitation, and pulled my boy from the rapids just before they would have carried him to his death. Roberto lived because this warrior risked his own life for a stranger's child. Her voice grew fierce with protective loyalty. I would do anything for such a man, even if it meant risking everything I've built here over the years. The third key figure in their growing alliance was Luke McGraw, a broken shell of humanity whose 55 years had been marked by loss, disappointment, and increasing dependence on alcohol to numb emotional pain that had become too great to bear while maintaining sobriety. When Clara first encountered him in Riggs' office, he was nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey and mumbling to himself about better days. "That's Luke," Riggs explained quietly. "Used to be one of the best miners in the territory before the drink got hold of him. Worked with your father, if I remember correctly." Clara approached the older man carefully, her baby cradled in her arms. "Mr. McGraw, I'm Clara Bell. John Bell was my father." McGraw's bleary eyes focused on her with difficulty, but recognition gradually dawned in his expression. "John's girl. But you're all grown up now. And that baby." He shook his head as if trying to clear away confusion. "Your pa was a good man, miss. Honest as they come. Do you remember what happened to him?" Clara asked gently. "Of course I remember." McGraw said, his voice gaining clarity as he concentrated on the past. "John found something that scared him bad. Documents proving that Thorne was stealing claims left and right, forging papers, bribing officials. Your father spent months building a case that would stick." "What kind of documents?" Yiska interjected. McGraw's hands shook as he set down his bottle, and Clara noticed how his eyes darted nervously toward the door. "Ledgers, letters, contracts, all proving that Thorne murdered his own brother to take control of the family mining business. Your father hid everything in the old North Ridge shaft, sealed in waterproof containers where they'd be safe from fire or flood. What none of them noticed was how McGraw's gaze lingered on the reward posters tacked to Riggs' bulletin board, or how his fingers trembled not just from alcohol withdrawal, but from nervous calculation of what $500 could mean to a man who had nothing left to lose. The moral struggle within McGraw was genuine and painful. Part of him authentically wanted to help Clara reclaim her father's legacy and see Thorne punished for his systematic crimes against honest miners and their families. But another part of his damaged psyche, weakened by years of disappointment and strengthened by desperate need for redemption and escape, found the Silver Baron's offer increasingly difficult to resist. These relationships, forged by necessity, but strengthened by growing mutual respect and shared commitment to justice, would prove essential in the struggle ahead. None of the participants fully understood the scope of the conflict they were entering, or the personal costs it would exact from everyone involved, but each brought unique skills, knowledge, and moral courage that would contribute to whatever outcome awaited them in the dangerous days ahead. As Clara's strength slowly returned, and her infant son grew stronger with each passing day under Naliehe's expert care, the temporary peace of their sanctuary began to feel increasingly fragile. Reports reached them through various channels: Marisol's ferry customers, Riggs' official communications, and Yiska's own network of tribal scouts, indicating massive mobilization throughout Thorne's vast network of corruption and violence. 50 men at least reported a Navajo scout who had observed the gathering from concealed positions in the hills. Armed with military weapons, organized like soldiers rather than ordinary bounty hunters. "They're not just looking for the woman anymore," Riggs added grimly during one of his visits to coordinate intelligence. "Word is that Thorne has put a price on everyone who's helped her, Yumi, Marisol, even the tribal elders who provided shelter." The crisis arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike, on a night when thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire from some distant but approaching battlefield. Yiska stood guard outside Naliehe's hogan, with his Winchester rifle loaded and ready, scanning the darkness for signs of approaching trouble. When he first spotted the telltale glow of torches moving systematically across the landscape in organized search patterns. "They're coming," he said quietly to Clara, who was nursing her son by the light of a carefully shielded oil lamp. "At least 50 riders, maybe more." Clara's face paled, but her voice remained steady. How much time do we have? Minutes, not hours. Yiska replied, already gathering their few possessions. Can you ride? I'll have to, Clara said, securing the baby in his cradleboard with practiced efficiency. There's no choice now. As they prepared for immediate flight, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She removed the rusted locket from around her neck and opened it carefully, revealing the precious document fragment that had cost her family so dearly. Before we run again, she said, her voice firm with resolve, I need you to understand exactly what we're fighting for. Even in the dim light, Yiska could read enough of the faded but still legible handwriting to grasp its enormous significance. The document was a portion of an original deed dated 1870, clearly identifying John Bell as the legal owner of what was now called the Prosperity Silver Mine, the richest and most profitable mineral deposit in New Mexico territory. This is why they hunt you with such relentless determination. Yiska said, understanding flooding through him as he examined the precious paper. Not revenge, not simple greed, fear of complete exposure and destruction. If this reaches honest authorities, Thorne's entire empire collapses. Clara confirmed, taking back the locket and securing it around her neck once more. Every deed he holds, every claim he's filed, every partnership with corrupt officials, all built on the theft of my father's discovery. But their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves growing steadily louder. The search party had found their location, and escape was now their only option for survival. Without hesitation, Yiska lifted Clara and the baby onto Windrunner's back, ensuring they were securely positioned for the dangerous journey ahead. Behind them, Naliehe gathered her most essential medicines and prepared to evacuate the camp with the other tribal families. Go, the elder woman said simply in English, pressing a small leather pouch into Clara's hands. Medicine for baby, for healing. As they rode into the darkness, with torches visible in multiple directions around them, Clara clutched both her child and her father's legacy, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in the struggle that had already cost so many lives. The chase across the painted desert became a nightmare of endurance and survival skills, as Thorne's men pursued them through treacherous terrain that could kill the unwary within minutes. The desert's stunning beauty layers of red, orange, and purple rock carved by centuries of wind and water concealed dangers that tested every limit of human and animal capability. Flash flood channels cut deep gashes across their path, invisible until Windrunner was almost upon them. Loose rock shifted without warning, sending avalanches of stone tumbling into the darkness below. Hidden crevasses opened like mouths, waiting to swallow anyone who made a single mistake in navigation. Clara clung to both Yiska and her baby, as bullets whistled past their heads and ricocheted off nearby rocks with deadly whines. The infant mercifully seemed to sleep through much of the chaos, his small body relaxed against his mother's chest, despite the violence surrounding them. There, shouted one of their pursuers as lightning illuminated their position. They're heading for Devil's Canyon. Yiska knew the terrain. They were approaching a narrow passage that could provide either escape or become a death trap if they were cornered inside. But with enemies closing from multiple directions, they had no choice but to risk everything on the dangerous route ahead. As they entered, the canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating echoing chambers that amplified every sound. Behind them, the thunder of pursuing horses grew louder as their enemies realized the tactical opportunity they had been given. We're trapped, Clara said, seeing the sheer rock wall that blocked the far end of the passage. There's nowhere to go. But Yiska's trained eye had spotted something their pursuers had missed: a narrow ledge that ran along one wall of the canyon, barely wide enough for a sure-footed horse, but offering potential access to higher ground and continued flight. Then hold tight, he told Clara, guiding Windrunner onto the treacherous path as the first gunman appeared at the canyon entrance. Don't look down. The ascent was terrifying, in its sustained danger and ever-present threat of catastrophic failure. Windrunner's hooves sought purchase on loose stone, while bullets sparked off the rocks around them. Several times, Clara was certain they would all fall to their deaths, but somehow the horse's skill and Yiska's guidance carried them upward toward safety. When they finally reached level ground above the canyon, their pursuers were milling in confusion below, unable to follow the route that had saved their quarry from capture or death. But the respite was temporary. As they continued across the desert toward Marisol's ferry crossing, Clara realized that her ordeal was far from over. Behind them, Thorne's men were already spreading out to search for alternative routes, and ahead lay more dangers that would test everyone's commitment to justice and survival. At the Rio Grande crossing, Marisol acted with characteristic decisiveness when she saw them approaching with pursuit close behind. Without waiting for explanations or guarantees of payment, she helped Clara and the baby into her ferry, while preparing to face whatever consequences might follow. "They will come here looking for you," she warned as they drifted across the dark water. "I cannot hide you indefinitely." "I know," Clara replied, holding her son close as they reached the opposite shore. "But I also know that running forever isn't the answer. Somehow we have to make a stand." It was Riggs who provided the next crucial piece of their developing strategy when they reached his office in Willow's End. The deputy had been conducting his own investigation into Thorne's operations, and his discoveries aligned perfectly with Clara's inherited evidence. "I've been documenting corruption for months." He admitted, showing them a collection of official reports and witness statements. "But I lacked the key evidence that would make the charges stick in court. Your father's papers could be exactly what we need." "Where are these documents McGraw mentioned?" Yiska asked. "The North Ridge shaft." Riggs confirmed. "Abandoned 2 years ago after several fatal accidents. Nobody goes there anymore because of cave-ins and poisonous gases." Clara made her decision with the quiet determination that had carried her through a year of persecution and hardship. "Then that's where we go. Whatever the risks, we have to recover my father's evidence before Thorne destroys it." McGraw, who had been listening to their conversation from his position near the window, turned toward them with an expression that mixed hope and terrible guilt. The internal struggle that had been building within him finally reached its breaking point, as he realized he could no longer maintain the deception that was eating away at his soul. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Something terrible that I've done." But before he could complete his confession, shouts from outside announced that their hiding place had been discovered. Through the windows, they could see riders surrounding the building, torches held high and weapons ready for immediate action. U.S. Deputy called a voice from the darkness. "Send out the woman and her bastard child, and nobody else gets hurt." Riggs drew his service revolver with hands that remained steady despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "There's a back way out," he told Yiska quietly. "Through the cells and out the rear door. You might make it to the stable before they surround the whole building." But Clara had heard enough running, enough hiding, enough compromising with evil to last several lifetimes. Her father had died trying to gather evidence against corruption, her family had been murdered to silence their voices, and her son would grow up in a world where justice was for sale to the highest bidder unless someone finally made a stand. "On no more running," she said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "If we're going to retrieve those documents, we do it now while they're focused on this building. McGraw, you know the way to the mine better than anyone. Will you help us?" The broken ex-miner looked at her with tears streaming down his weathered face, the weight of his intended betrayal crushing his spirit, but also perhaps offering a chance for redemption. "I was going to sell you out," he admitted with brutal honesty. "Thorne's men offered me enough money to start over somewhere else, and I was weak enough to consider it." "But you didn't," Yiska observed. "You're still here, still talking to us instead of opening that door for his gunmen." "I can't do it." McGraw said, his voice breaking with emotion. I can't betray John Bell's daughter, not after everything your family suffered because of that monster. If you're willing to trust a worthless drunk who almost sold you for silver, I'll guide you to those documents myself. The decision to venture into the abandoned Northridge mine represented a calculated risk that could either provide them with the evidence needed to destroy Thorne's empire or result in their deaths deep underground where their bodies would never be found. But as gunfire erupted around Riggs's office and smoke began to fill the building, Clara realized they had no choice but to attempt the desperate mission that might be their only chance for justice. The mine entrance lay 5 miles outside Willow's End, accessible through a maze of old mining roads and forgotten trails that wound through terrain scarred by years of industrial excavation. As they made their way through the darkness on foot, leaving Windrunner hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, the sounds of battle behind them gradually faded into ominous silence. Riggs. Clara whispered, worried about the deputy who had stayed behind to provide covering fire for their escape. He's a survivor. McGraw assured her, though his own voice carried uncertainty. Been dealing with impossible situations for 20 years. If anyone can talk his way out of this mess, it's Samuel Riggs. The Northridge shaft descended into the earth at a steep angle that immediately suggested structural problems supported by timber beams that had rotted and warped under the weight of unstable rock formations above. Water seeped continuously through cracked walls, creating treacherous pools and streams that made footing uncertain and filled the air with humidity that seemed to press against their lungs like a living thing. Careful now, McGraw warned as they ventured deeper into the abandoned workings. The gas pockets down here can kill you before you realize you're in danger. If you start feeling dizzy or sick, we head for the surface immediately. The deeper they went, the more apparent it became that this expedition could easily become a suicide mission, regardless of whether they found John Bell's hidden evidence. Loose rock fell constantly from the ceiling, sometimes in individual stones, that could cause serious injury, sometimes in larger cascades that threatened to block their retreat entirely. Strange creaking and groaning sounds echoed through the tunnels as structural supports shifted under pressures they had never been designed to bear. The air grew thicker and more difficult to breathe with each step deeper into the earth, suggesting the presence of dangerous gases that could cause unconsciousness or death without warning. Clara struggled with the physical demands of underground exploration while carrying her infant son. But her determination to recover her father's legacy drove her forward despite obvious exhaustion and growing fear. The baby seemed to sense the danger around them, fussing more than usual, and clinging to his mother with tiny hands that gripped her dress with desperate strength. Just a little further. McGraw encouraged his knowledge of the mine's layout, proving invaluable as they navigated through passages that would have been impossible to find without guidance. John was smart about hiding things. He chose a spot where casual searchers would never think to look. Deep within the mountain, in a side chamber that required crawling through a passage barely wide enough for human bodies, they finally found what they were searching for, with growing desperation. A rusted lockbox lay buried under a carefully arranged pile of rocks, exactly where McGraw's fragmentary memories had suggested it would be located. Inside the waterproof container were documents that exceeded even their highest expectations for useful evidence. Ledgers signed by Thorne's late brother confirmed that the Prosperity Mine had been purchased legally in John Bell's name in 1870, providing indisputable proof of legitimate ownership that could stand up in any honest court. But more importantly, the papers detailed a systematic pattern of theft, murder, and corruption that extended far beyond a single mining claim. Elias Thorne had murdered his own brother in 1872 to prevent exposure of the original theft, then used the accumulated profits to bribe territorial officials and create false documentation for dozens of additional claims throughout the region. Among the most damaging evidence was a letter in John Bell's careful handwriting addressed to Clara personally and revealing the deeply personal nature of Thorne's vendetta against their family. My dearest daughter. The letter began. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer able to protect you from the truth I should have revealed years ago. 20 years past, Elias Thorne and I were partners in a smaller claim north of Silver Creek. I discovered that he had murdered a Mexican family to steal their ancestral land grant, and when I threatened to expose his crimes, he tried to have me killed as well. Clara's hands trembled as she read her father's words by the flickering light of their oil lantern. The full scope of Thorne's evil was even worse than she had imagined, extending back decades and encompassing countless innocent victims who had been murdered for their land, their resources, or simply their knowledge of his activities. I made a terrible mistake. The letter continued. I allowed Thorne to believe I had died in his ambush, thinking that if I disappeared quietly and built my own success honestly, the past could remain buried and our family would be safe from his vengeance. But men like Elias Thorne never forget a threat to their power, and his persecution of our family has always been about more than simple greed for our mine. The revelation that Thorne's campaign against the Bell family was motivated by personal revenge, as much as financial gain, added a chilling dimension to their struggle. This was not merely a business dispute that could be resolved through legal channels or negotiated settlements. It was a blood feud that would only end with the complete destruction of one side or the other. This fight is about more than silver or property rights. John Bell's letter concluded. It is about justice for all the innocent people Thorne has murdered over the years, and about ensuring that his reign of terror ends before he can destroy more families like ours. Clara held the precious documents with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full magnitude of her father's sacrifice and the responsibility that had now passed to her. He died trying to protect us. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And now it's up to us to finish what he started. But as she spoke these words of determination and hope, McGraw's expression underwent a transformation that revealed the true depth of his internal struggle. The guilt and desperate need that had been building inside him for days finally overwhelmed whatever genuine loyalty he had felt toward his new companions, and the promise of redemption offered by Thorne's agents proved stronger than his conscience. His face twisted with a mixture of self-loathing and determined greed as he slowly reached for a heavy mining shovel that had been left behind by previous workers. "I'm sorry, girl," he said, his voice shaking with emotion that was entirely real despite his treacherous intentions. "I truly am sorry, but I made a bargain with Thorne's people that I can't back out of now." "McGraw, don't," Yeska warned, recognizing the danger and reaching for his rifle. But the ex-miner was already in motion, driven by desperation and the promise of enough money to escape his miserable existence forever. "I need that land in California more than I need whatever's left of my conscience," he said, raising the shovel above his head with obvious reluctance but implacable determination. The improvised weapon crashed down on Yiska's skull with sickening force before the warrior could fully react to the sudden threat from someone he had trusted completely. Blood flowed freely from the head wound as the unconscious Navajo collapsed among the rocks, his rifle clattering away into darkness beyond immediate reach. Clara screamed in shock and terror as McGraw grabbed her roughly by the arm, dragging her toward the tunnel entrance, while she clutched the precious ledgers against her chest and tried to protect her baby from the violence erupting around them. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," McGraw pleaded, though his actions contradicted any claim to mercy or reluctance. "Thorne's men are waiting outside just like I arranged, and they'll pay me enough to disappear forever if I deliver you and those papers." "You're making a mistake," Clara said, fighting against his grip, while keeping her voice steady to avoid frightening her child further. "Those documents prove Thorne is a murderer. Do you really want to help him escape justice?" "Justice?" McGraw laughed bitterly. "I've been waiting 20 years for justice, and all I got was poverty, alcohol, and watching good men die in Thorne's mines while he got richer. At least his money is real. Outside the mine entrance, exactly as McGraw had secretly arranged, through coded messages delivered throughout their planning sessions, 50 of Thorne's best riders waited in organized military formation. These were not the desperate bounty hunters and casual killers who had pursued Clara across the territory for months, but professional soldiers equipped with modern weapons and commanded by men who had experience in actual warfare against both Indian tribes and territorial militias. Elias Thorne himself stood at the center of the formation, a figure of authority and barely controlled violence, whose expensive clothing and silver-plated weapons marked him as someone accustomed to absolute power over life and death. His cold eyes fixed on Clara with the intensity of a predator examining wounded prey that could no longer escape or resist effectively. "Miss Bell," he said with mock courtesy that made his true intentions even more chilling. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience and substantial expense over the past year. I trust you understand that this unpleasantness ends today one way or another. Here she is, just like I promised," McGraw announced as he pushed Clara forward into the harsh morning sunlight, the evidence of Thorne's crimes still clutched in her protective embrace. "One thief and her bastard child, plus all the proof she thinks she needs to steal what rightfully belongs to you." He accepted his payment, a heavy leather bag containing silver coins and legal documents promising land ownership in California, then walked away without looking back at the people he had betrayed. The money felt heavier in his hands than he had expected, weighted with implications he tried desperately to ignore. Behind them, deliberately triggered explosive charges brought down a significant portion of the tunnel system, trapping Yiska under tons of rock and debris, in what appeared to be a permanent solution to the problem he represented. The Navajo warrior, who had interfered with Thorne's operations, would trouble no one ever again, and buried alive in the darkness, where his body would never be found by authorities or mourning relatives. Now then, Thorne continued his attention focused entirely on Clara and the documents she carried. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. Papers that were stolen from my offices by your late father, if I'm not mistaken." Clara clutched her baby protectively, while staring defiantly at the man who had murdered her family and destroyed her life. Despite her apparent helplessness and the overwhelming odds against survival, her voice remained steady as she spoke. "Those documents prove you're a thief and a murderer," she said with conviction that surprised even herself. "They detail every crime you've committed over the past 20 years, including the murder of your own brother and dozens of innocent families whose only mistake was owning land you wanted to steal." Thorne laughed with genuine amusement at her defiance, as if he were dealing with a child who didn't understand the realities of adult power and corruption. "My dear girl, even if those papers were authentic, which I naturally dispute, they would be meaningless in any court that matters. I own the territorial government from the governor down to the local justices of the peace. Judges, sheriffs, prosecutors, territorial representatives, they all depend on my financial support for their careers and their families' welfare. Then we'll see about federal courts," Clara replied with growing confidence. "About congressional investigators who don't take bribes from territorial mining barons. About newspaper reporters in Denver and San Francisco who specialize in exposing corruption." For the first time since their confrontation began, Thorne's expression showed genuine concern rather than dismissive arrogance. The possibility that this young woman's evidence might reach authorities beyond his direct influence had obviously occurred to him, and he was prepared to take extreme measures to prevent such a catastrophe. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. "You see, both you and your illegitimate child are about to die in a tragic mining accident. Cave-ins are unfortunately common in these old shafts, and rescue efforts rarely succeed in time to save the victims." He turned to his men with the casual authority of someone giving routine orders. "Seal the entrance after you put them inside. Make sure there's enough explosive to bring down the main supports. Some problems require permanent solutions that can't be undone by future investigators. But as his subordinates moved to carry out these murderous instructions, the sound of gunfire erupted from the collapsed mine entrance behind them. Dust and debris scattered in all directions as someone or something moved within the tunnel system that was supposed to have become a tomb, suggesting that reports of Yiska's death had been premature and overly optimistic. Hours had passed in crushing darkness and seemingly hopeless circumstances before Yiska regained consciousness beneath the pile of rocks and timber that should have been his grave. The head wound from McGraw's shovel had left him disoriented, and weak blood flowing freely down his face and obscuring his vision, but his warrior's training and sheer determination to survive had gradually overcome the physical trauma and mental confusion. Using nothing but his bare hands and fragments of broken mining tools scattered throughout the collapsed chamber, he had slowly worked to free himself from the cave-in that was supposed to have ended his interference permanently. The process had required enormous physical effort and mental discipline, forcing him to remain calm and methodical, despite the constant threat of additional collapse that could bury him even deeper underground. A narrow ventilation shaft exposed by the explosion-triggered cave-in had provided his eventual route to freedom, through patient excavation and careful navigation of spaces barely wide enough for human passage. The climb toward the surface had been a nightmare of physical endurance and psychological determination, with several moments where further progress seemed impossible, and death appeared inevitable. But Yiska's intimate knowledge of underground terrain, combined with his absolute refusal to accept defeat, while innocent lives hung in the balance, had carried him through obstacles that would have stopped most men permanently. When he finally emerged into daylight, bloodied and exhausted but very much alive, he could hear Clara's voice rising in defiant argument with her captors. Moving with the legendary stealth that had made him feared by enemies and respected by allies throughout the territory, Yiska positioned himself among the rocks above the mine entrance, where he could observe the full scope of Thorn's forces while remaining hidden from immediate detection. The odds were impossible by any rational calculation. 50 armed men in professional military formation, commanded by experienced officers and equipped with superior weapons. But Yiska had never been governed entirely by rational calculations when innocent lives hung in the balance and justice demanded action regardless of personal cost. Clara had risked everything to reclaim her rightful inheritance and expose the truth about systematic corruption that had destroyed countless families. Her infant son deserved the chance to grow up in a world where such evil could be confronted and defeated, rather than accepted as inevitable. His first shot, fired from concealment with the deadly accuracy that had made him legendary, dropped one of Thorn's lieutenants before anyone realized they were under attack from an unexpected direction. The second shot scattered the horses and created confusion that allowed Yiska to advance to a better position, while his enemies tried to locate the source of the precise, devastating fire that was picking off their men with mechanical efficiency. The battle that erupted around the North Ridge mine would be remembered as one of the most desperate and heroic last stands in territorial history, though few would ever know the complete truth about the motivations behind the conflict or the enormous stakes involved in its outcome. From his position among the rocks, Yiska continued to fire with calculated precision, while Thorn's men gradually organized their response and began to surround his location with overwhelming force. Each shot was carefully aimed to maximize damage to enemy capabilities, while conserving ammunition that would inevitably be exhausted long before all threats were eliminated. But even as he fought with growing desperation against impossible odds, Yiska could see that Clara remained surrounded and apparently helpless, still clutching both her baby and the evidence that could destroy Thorn's empire if it survived the next few critical minutes. The Silver Baron himself had taken cover behind an overturned supply wagon, his expensive revolver ready for use. But his attention focused more on ensuring Clara's permanent silence than on the tactical situation developing around him. In his arrogance and confidence in numerical superiority, he had failed to anticipate that a single determined enemy could pose any serious threat to his carefully planned operation. That miscalculation would prove to be fatal, though the final resolution of their life and death struggle still depended on factors beyond anyone's direct control. As the sound of additional hooves echoed across the landscape from multiple directions, everyone involved in the battle wondered whether the newcomers would tip the balance toward justice or corruption, survival or destruction, hope or the final triumph of greed over human decency and basic moral principles. The riders who appeared on the horizon as gunfire raged around the mine entrance were not additional reinforcements for Thorne's overwhelming forces, but rather Deputy Riggs leading a hastily assembled posse of armed settlers, miners, and townspeople who had finally reached their breaking point with systematic oppression and decided to risk everything in support of justice. Riggs had survived the attack on his office through a combination of tactical skill and desperate courage, then spent the remaining hours of darkness recruiting men who had suffered under Thorne's corruption for years but lacked the organization and leadership necessary to mount effective resistance. Clara's fight had provided the catalyst they needed to overcome individual fear and unite in common cause against their oppressor. Those are honest folks. Riggs called out as his men engaged Thorne's forces from multiple directions. Miners whose families died in unsafe conditions, ranchers whose land was stolen through forged documents, storekeepers who were driven out of business by Thorne's monopolistic practices. They'd been waiting years for a chance to strike back. Marisol Vega rode alongside the deputy, her ferry business having provided the communication network necessary to coordinate the uprising on such short notice. "Everyone along the river knows what's happening here," she shouted above the gunfire. "Win or lose, word will spread about Clara's evidence and Thorne's crimes." The arrival of unexpected allies transformed the tactical situation immediately and dramatically. Thorne's men, who had been supremely confident in their overwhelming numerical advantage, suddenly found themselves caught between Yiska's deadly accurate fire from above and a coordinated attack by armed civilians who knew the terrain intimately and fought with the fury of people who had been systematically oppressed for too long. The battle became a chaotic melee as professional killers discovered that superior weapons and military training were not always sufficient to overcome local knowledge, personal motivation, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges when people fight for their homes, their families, and fundamental principles of justice that transcend individual survival. Clara, still holding her baby and the precious documents that represented her father's legacy, found herself at the center of a whirlwind of violence that would determine not just her personal fate, but the future of everyone who lived under Thorne's shadow of corruption and fear. The evidence her father had died to preserve was now within minutes of either reaching the authorities who could act on it or being destroyed forever, along with everyone who knew of its existence. As bullets flew in all directions and men died around her, Clara made a decision that would demonstrate the courage and intelligence she had inherited from John Bell. Rather than cowering in helpless terror or waiting passively for rescue that might never come, she began to move deliberately through the chaos of battle, using the confusion and smoke to work her way toward a position where she could take direct action to protect both her child and her father's evidence. But Elias Thorne was not finished with his campaign of murder and intimidation. Realizing that his carefully planned operation was dissolving into potential defeat, despite every advantage he had possessed at the beginning of the confrontation, he made his own desperate decision to end the threat personally rather than continuing to rely on subordinates whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned through respect or shared ideological commitment. The Silver Baron rose from behind his protective cover with his silver-plated revolver drawn, and ready, his face twisted with rage and desperation, as he advanced toward the young woman who had caused him so much trouble over the past year. In his arrogance and fury, he failed to notice that Yiska had worked his way closer during the ongoing battle, positioning himself for one final shot that could end the conflict decisively in favor of justice over corruption. The confrontation between Clara Bell and Elias Thorne surrounded by violence and chaos that would determine the fate of everyone involved, represented the climactic moment when individual courage and moral clarity would either triumph over systematic evil or be crushed beneath the weight of money power and institutionalized corruption that had dominated territorial politics for too many years. As the two faced each other in the midst of battle, Clara holding her baby protectively, while Thorn raised his weapon with murderous intent. The future of New Mexico territory hung in the balance, waiting to be decided by choices that would echo through generations and determine whether justice was possible in a world where wealth seemed to purchase immunity from the consequences of even the most heinous crimes. The final moment arrived with the sudden clarity that sometimes emerges from chaos, as if time itself had slowed to allow everyone involved to understand the full significance of what was about to happen. Elias Thorn stood less than 10 feet from Clara. His ornate revolver aimed directly at her heart, his face contorted with the rage of a man who had never been successfully defied by anyone during his decades of systematically expanding power and influence. "You should have stayed hidden in whatever hole you crawled out of." He snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger with obvious satisfaction at finally confronting the source of his recent troubles personally. "Your father should have minded his own business 20 years ago instead of threatening his betters with exposure and legal complications." But Clara Bell had inherited more than just legal documents from her father. She had also inherited his courage, his intelligence, and his absolute refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. As Thorn prepared to fire, she made a desperate gambit that would either save her life or ensure that her father's evidence survived, even if she did not. With a sudden movement that caught the Silver Baron completely off guard, Clara threw the leather portfolio containing John Bell's carefully preserved documentation toward the mineshaft entrance. Knowing that Thorn's greed and paranoia would force him to choose between killing her immediately and ensuring that the evidence of his crimes was destroyed before it could reach federal authorities. "Those papers are the only copies," she shouted, her voice carrying across the battlefield with desperate conviction. "If they fall into that shaft, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering who else might have read them, who else might know the truth about your brother's murder and all the other families you've killed over the years." Thorn's eyes followed the portfolio's arc through the air, his attention divided for a crucial moment between immediate vengeance and long-term survival. That split second of hesitation gave Yiska the opening he had been waiting for throughout the entire confrontation, positioning himself for a shot that would end Elias Thorn's reign of terror forever. The Winchester rifle spoke with the voice of justice itself, its bullet striking Thorn's center mass and lifting him off his feet with the force of divine retribution. The Silver Baron's expensive revolver flew from nerveless fingers as he collapsed in the dust of the mine, where John Bell had hidden the evidence that would finally expose decades of systematic murder and theft. The death of their leader created a moment of stunned silence that spread across the battlefield like ripples on still water, affecting both sides of the conflict as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Thorn's men, who had followed him out of greed and fear rather than loyalty or ideological commitment, suddenly found themselves leaderless in a fight they no longer understood or believed they could win. Some threw down their weapons immediately and raised their hands in surrender, while others attempted to flee toward their horses before being stopped by armed settlers who had waited years for this opportunity to see justice done. The battle was effectively over, though scattered gunfire continued for several more minutes as the last of Thorn's supporters were captured or driven from the field. Clara quickly retrieved the scattered documents from where they had fallen, ensuring that none of her father's precious evidence was lost to the mine's depths or destroyed in the chaos of battle. Deputy Riggs reached her first, his weathered face showing both relief at her survival and amazement that they had actually succeeded against such overwhelming odds. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking both Clara and the baby for signs of injury from the violence that had erupted around them. "We're alive," she replied simply. then held up the leather portfolio with its contents intact. "And we have everything we need to make sure my father's death wasn't in vain." Luke McGraw was never seen again after that day, though some claim to have spotted an old man wandering the desert, calling out apologies to ghosts only he could see. Others said he had made it to California with his blood money, only to drink himself to death in a distant cantina where no one knew his name or cared about his reasons for weeping into his whiskey every night. The legal proceedings that followed Thorne's death were swift and comprehensive, once federal authorities took jurisdiction away from territorial courts that had been compromised by years of systematic bribery and intimidation. Clara's evidence proved sufficient not only to restore her rightful ownership of the Prosperity Mine, but also to overturn dozens of fraudulent claims throughout the region and prosecute surviving members of Thorne's criminal network. But Clara Bell had learned harsh lessons about the nature of power and the responsibility that came with wealth and influence, in a society where such advantages could be used either to help or to harm innocent people. Instead of operating the mine according to the exploitative practices that had made Thorne wealthy, she implemented revolutionary changes that would serve as a model for ethical business practices throughout the American West. Fair wages and safe working conditions aren't just morally right, she explained to territorial officials who questioned her methods and profit margins. They're good for business in the long term. When workers feel secure and respected, they're more productive, more loyal, and more likely to suggest improvements that benefit everyone. Environmental protection became a cornerstone of the mine's operations under Clara's management, with strict controls on mercury use, careful restoration of damaged landscapes, and consultation with Navajo tribal leaders about traditional ecological knowledge that could inform sustainable extraction practices. Yiska's crucial role in the victory secured not only protection for Navajo lands that had been threatened by Thorne's expansion plans, but also recognition from territorial and federal authorities that Native peoples possessed rights and knowledge that deserved respect, rather than systematic destruction through industrial development and military conquest. As autumn arrived in New Mexico territory, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of seasonal renewal after a long summer of struggle and violence, Clara stood at the Prosperity Mine's entrance, holding her healthy son and watching workers who earned fair wages for honest labor under safe conditions that prioritized human life over maximum profit extraction. The mine continued to produce silver at profitable levels, but now its wealth supported not only Clara's family, but also the broader community through wages, infrastructure investment, and social programs that benefited everyone, regardless of their ethnic background or previous relationship to the Thorne regime. Yiska prepared to return to his tribe, with the satisfaction of knowing that his intervention had achieved both justice for Clara's family and meaningful protection for his own people's ancestral lands and traditional way of life. But as he mounted Windrunner for the journey home, Clara approached him with a weathered tin box she had discovered among her father's carefully preserved papers and personal effects. "This was meant for you," she said, offering him the container with obvious emotion. "My father wrote your name on it in his own handwriting, apparently expecting that you might someday be involved in settling his affairs." Inside the box were letters John Bell had written before his disappearance, including one addressed specifically to Navajo tribal leaders that detailed a partnership agreement dating back to 1865. The document promised the tribe 20% of the mine's annual profits in exchange for their guidance and protection during his original prospecting efforts, recognizing both their superior knowledge of the terrain and their legitimate claims to resources extracted from ancestral territory. The revelation transformed Clara's inheritance from simple personal wealth into a symbol of cooperation between different peoples, proving that mutual respect and shared prosperity were possible even in the harsh realities of frontier life, where racial prejudice and economic exploitation had been accepted as inevitable by most Anglo settlers. Nor stort Then this fight was never just about saving one person or recovering stolen property. Yiska realized examining the legal documents that gave his people a permanent stake in the mine's continued operation and environmental stewardship. It was about restoring what was taken from all of us and building something better for future generations. Clara nodded, shifting her baby to one arm while gesturing toward the mine entrance, where work continued under new management principles that emphasized cooperation rather than domination. The partnership my father envisioned can finally work now. Your people understand this land better than anyone else alive. Together we can prove that economic development and environmental protection don't have to be enemies. Over the following months, as news of their success spread throughout the territory and beyond its borders, Clara and Yiska's alliance became a powerful symbol of what was possible when people of different backgrounds united around shared principles of justice, environmental responsibility, and mutual respect for human dignity, regardless of racial or cultural differences. The Prosperity Mine flourished under its new cooperative management structure. But now its wealth supported not just individual enrichment, but community development that included schools, medical facilities, and agricultural programs, combining traditional Navajo farming techniques with modern methods to restore productivity to lands damaged by previous extractive practices. Marisol expanded her ferry service with financial backing from the mine's profits, creating a transportation network that served the entire river valley, while employing workers from multiple ethnic communities on equal terms and providing economic opportunities that had never existed under Thorne's monopolistic control. Deputy Riggs was promoted to territorial marshal, giving him the authority and resources needed to combat corruption wherever it appeared throughout the Southwest, with backing from federal officials who recognized that systematic reform was necessary to prevent future abuses of power. Clara's son grew strong and healthy, raised with knowledge of both his mother's determination and his grandfather's integrity, but also with understanding of Yiska's courage and traditional Navajo wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world rather than attempting to dominate and exploit it for short-term gain. As winter arrived and snow began to cover the mountains surrounding the Prosperity Mine, Clara and Yiska stood together at the operations headquarters, reviewing reports that showed environmental restoration proceeding ahead of schedule, while silver production remained profitable enough to support all their social programs and partnership obligations to both Anglo and Native communities. Behind them lay months of struggle loss and hard-won victory against corruption that had seemed impossible to overcome through individual action or legal channels. Ahead stretched a future built on the foundation John Bell had envisioned, one that honored both the land and all the people who depended on it for their survival, prosperity, and spiritual connection to something larger than immediate self-interest. The mine that had been built on theft, violence, and systematic oppression now served as a beacon of justice and cooperation, proving that even in the harsh world of the frontier, honor could triumph over greed. Different peoples could find common ground in shared values, and individual courage could inspire the kind of social change that benefited entire communities for generations to come. Clara held her son close as they watched the sun set over New Mexico territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise continued prosperity and peace for all who were willing to work together rather than against each other. The battles were over, the enemies defeated or reformed, and justice had prevailed through the combined efforts of people who had chosen to fight for what was right rather than what was immediately profitable or personally convenient. The evidence of systematic corruption had been preserved and acted upon, the innocent had been protected and empowered, and the guilty had faced appropriate consequences for their crimes against both individual families and the broader community. Most importantly, a new model for economic development had been established that proved prosperity and justice could coexist when people were willing to prioritize human welfare and environmental stewardship over short-term profits and personal enrichment. As darkness fell over the territory, bringing with it the promise of peaceful sleep and continued hope for a better future. Clara and Yiska understood that their alliance had created something larger and more important than either of them could have achieved alone. They had proven that courage, determination, and moral clarity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds when people were willing to sacrifice for principles that transcended individual self-interest and immediate gratification. The story that had begun with a desperate flight through a violent tempest had ended with the establishment of justice, the restoration of rightful inheritance, and the creation of partnerships that would benefit both Anglo and Native peoples for generations to come. Truth had triumphed over deception, cooperation had overcome exploitation, and the future held genuine promise for continued progress toward a more just and equitable society for all who called the American West their home.